Hi, and welcome to Bernard's Book Club. And the book that we've been looking at is Not So Black and White by Kenan Malik, a comprehensive and potent exploration of race and the politics of race, and whose ideas I've set out in two films, which I've called firstly The Invention of Race and secondly Transcending Race. And this is the second and final of these, Transcending Race, whose ideas I've set out in two sections, each with three parts. The first section I've called The Road to Identity, with parts called Critiquing the Enlightenment, Identity Embraced from Pan Africanism to Black Lives Matter, and White Identity Politics. The second section I've called Reclaiming the Universal, with parts called Critiquing Identity Politics, Reclaiming the Radical Enlightenment, and finally, Restoring Class and Reviving the Political. So, kicking off then with Section 1, The Road to Identity, Part 1, Critiquing the Enlightenment. And this begins with Critiquing the Enlightenment because Not So Black and White seeks not only to detail the origins of race as an idea, it's also concerned with the politics best able to confront and ultimately to transcend racism. And it's from the Enlightenment that we find the first of two traditions seeking to do this. A tradition that represents the politics of universalism and universal rights, against which stands an alternative tradition as the politics of identity and of particular rights. And between them, these two approaches have shaped the response to racism over 4 centuries, woven themselves through European and American history, and are very much at the centre of this book. And this first part begins with the tradition of political identity, which has been articulated across American history as variously Pan Africanism, Black Power, and more recently Black Lives Matter, all of which begin with the rejection of the European Enlightenment and its claim for the universal rights of man. And this is, of course, a rejection of the Enlightenment as a product of European civilization. And given the scale of European racism and racial barbarism, which I detailed in the last film, and the fact that the Enlightenment is the foundation of European political culture and self-identity, it's easy to see why Frantz Fanon observed that Europeans are never done talking of man, yet murder them everywhere, and they do so in the name of the spirit of Europe. Going on to question, if Europe is responsible for the subjugation of more than half the world, what worth could there be in its political and moral ideas? At best, they failed to prevent that subjugation, and at worst, they provided its intellectual grounding. And the central charge against both Europe and its celebrated Enlightenment philosophy is that of hypocrisy. And the hypocrisy of an Enlightenment tradition proclaiming the self-evident truth that all men are born equal, while the leaders of Europe, the supposed home of the rights of man, were actively occupying and enslaving vast numbers of them, are well known and well documented, with even the most humane of Enlightenment thinkers guilty of racist attitudes. Like liberalism itself, many see this as a fraudulent and bourgeois radicalism for a bourgeois world, speaking the language of universal human rights while simultaneously preserving its many forms of hierarchy in a philosophy that was never intended to apply to the people beyond Europe. A quintessentially European philosophy which held that whiteness was a condition for personhood and all the rights that came from that personhood, and that civilization was nothing more than an expression of Western culture. And as such, and for all its self-congratulation, the Enlightenment, it is argued, should not be seen as a moral revolution, but as the cradle of racism, whose very claim to ethical advance stands alongside slavery and imperialism as just one more expression of cultural and racial superiority. And this idea that the Enlightenment was as much an instrument for power and domination as it was a force for freedom and democracy, has been framed as a kind of will to power, which is how the post-Second World War Marxist-inspired Frankfurt School came to see it, who, in the shadow of Auschwitz, saw barbarism stitched into the very fabric of European modernity, and saw an impulse to power and control as the hidden logic behind enlightenment rationality. As Herbert Marcuse put it, concentration camps, mass exterminations, world wars and atom bombs are no relapse into barbarism, but the unrepressed implementation of the achievements of modern science, technology and domination. And against such a devastating critique, it is no surprise that Europe, as the not-so-long-ago home of slavery and mass murder, for many cannot be an inspiration for anti-racist politics, a view now very much galvanised by the contemporary culture wars, where one's attitude to the Enlightenment has come to mark one's place on the cultural war map, and to defend it is to defend racism and imperialism. And surely, against centuries of perceived failure, it might be expected that a succession of black leaders and movements have looked not to the politics of solidarity, dependent as it is on the elusive and unreliable goodwill of white allies, but to its own people, to their shared interests and identity as the source of self-generated salvation. Which brings us to part 2, identity embraced from Pan Africanism to Black Lives Matter. And the first thing to say here is that identity politics is nothing new, and Europe, and particularly America, has been home to serial expressions of black identity politics, expressed in successive waves of self-organisation, each speaking to its own moment and circumstance, in Pan-Africanism, the Negritude movement, Black Power and Black Lives Matter, each powerfully expressing a particular claim for a black consciousness. And the first of these, Pan-Africanism, saw an identity rooted in the shared trauma of dispossession and loss. As one of the founders of Negritude, Aimé Césaire, put it, with its deportation of populations, its transfer of people from one continent to another, its distant memories of old beliefs, and its fragments of murdered cultures, the history of black people was the history of a community whose experience was unique. How can we not believe that all of this, which has its own coherence, constitutes a heritage? And beyond this, in what Paul Gilroy calls the Black Atlantic, slavery also created conditions for a common black identity spanning the Atlantic, as black sailors, wharf workers, fishermen and the enslaved crisscrossed the ocean from the 18th century onwards, generating both a black diaspora and a black internationalism. And this is the raw experience that will be shaped from the mid-19th century onwards by various leaders into a variety of Pan-Africanist visions. And it's worth saying that not all of these look to Africa as the home for a specifically African identity, with some, like W.E.B. Du Bois, locating the meaning of Africa in a larger struggle against imperialism. But for much of the Pan-African tradition, there was an unbreakable thread running through African history and the needs of African people, which together made for a black identity, and in a certain kind of way required, if not an African politics, then an African solution to the terrible legacies of transatlantic slavery. Thus, for Edward Wilmot Blyden, one of the first great Pan-Africanist leaders, as he puts it, the solution to the Negro problem in America would be to enable black people to return to Africa, where they would be free to discover themselves and once again become a people. And in this, and like the more widely known 20th century Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey, both Blyden and Garvey were channeling the philosophy of Johann Herder. Every race has developed its own code of life and can only flourish as a separate and unified people. Racial mixing leads to degeneration, and no mongrel state can succeed. All are arguments that began with Herder, but were now newly embraced by a generation of Pan Africanist leaders who saw in Africa not only a homeland, but a redemption for black people everywhere. And it's perhaps in the early 20th century negritude movement coming from France, where a Pan-Africanist black identity is given its most vigorous and confident expression, arguing that black people should turn back to Africa, the cradle of their civilization, and take pride in their blackness, black culture, and common origin. The black individual, another founder of negritude, Jane Nardell, argued, must not be the copy of another race. He must be himself, affirm his personality, and reclaim his essential black identity. And beyond Pan-Africanism, this torch of defiance and pride would, in the post-Second World War world, be most associated with the towering personalities of Frantz Fanon and Malcolm X. And whilst Malik is at pains to emphasise that these are complicated figures who cannot be located in the black identitarian tradition in any oversimplified way, both remain symbols of unyielding and unbending black nationalism, who laid the foundations for what would become the Black Power movement in the 1960s. Fanon, psychiatrist and figurehead for the Algerian Revolution, argued that white society refuses to give the black man an identity, making him an object and alienated from himself. And to become authentic, he has to reject the culture of the colonizer and reclaim his own history. Likewise, Malcolm X, whose parents were followers of Marcus Garvey, advised black people to freely disconnect from white America. And when Black Power emerged in the 1960s as the next incarnation of this stance, like all previous waves of black self-organisation, it was both the expression and the response to a wider set of circumstances, to the failure of the mainstream civil rights movement to eradicate poverty, low wages, infested housing, racist violence and police brutality, to the growing rage, frustration and thwarted hopes which exploded into a firestorm of inner-city rebellions across American cities between 1964 and 72, and to an international backdrop of the wars of independence in Algeria and Vietnam, European decolonisation, the Cuban Revolution and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And Black Power in America became part of this constellation, giving this frustrated rage a political language, and which came to see African Americans as a special kind of colony located in a wider white society too devoured by racism and subdued by consumerism for any kind of cross-racial solidarity, looking instead to self-help and ultimately self-determination. All of which was articulated in the language and symbols of Marxist-inspired revolution, most memorably by the Black Panthers, or more precisely, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, whose name, image and language positioned it as a form of counterpower to white supremacy, self-organising through what it called survival programmes of community provision and shadowing police patrols to monitor and protect against police violence. And in all of these movements and leaders, from Pan-Africanism through negritude, Frantz Fanon, Malcolm X and Black Power, we have the ancestry of Black Lives Matter. And as with Black Power, Black Lives Matter was both an expression and response to wider circumstances of continued police killings, including Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown and George Floyd, of the mass incarceration of black people, of political pessimism and loss of belief in the possibility of progress, and following the rise of neoliberalism, the diminished power of the labour movement, and an exponential increase in inequality, a growing disaffection on the left from the enlightenment, from class, and from class politics. And again, Black Lives Matter, like Black Power, looks to the Marxist template of a world characterised by innate oppression and absolute power, now remapped by critical race theory away from capitalism and onto the structures of white society. A society which Derek Bell, legal scholar and godfather to critical race theory, concluded was inescapably, institutionally, culturally and permanently racist. And yet, despite all of this, anti-racists, he argued, must continue to struggle against it. And this formula of challenging racism while believing it to be ineradicable has, for Malik, shaped the character of today's Black Lives Matter, shifting it from campaigns for material change towards demands for symbolic gestures and representational fairness, where combating racism cannot be about winning equality, but has become instead a project to carve out space and assert a degree of power and autonomy within that space. Invariably, this has been vilified as part of a larger condemnation of identity politics. And yet, as Malik tells us, most conservative critics of identity politics are not opposed to identity politics at all, just the identity politics of the left. Yet, white identity politics is as old as race itself. Indeed, the invention of race was its first expression, which brings us to part 3, white identity politics. And here, once it's recognised that race is indeed a category of identity, we can begin to see the long and varied tradition of white identity politics as a new code and instrument for hierarchy built upon the idea of race as a biological fact, a fiction of considerable power which served its purposes admirably. That is, until the Holocaust finally pushed this biological conception of race and the racist politics it supported into the shadows. Which is why, following the Second World War, the far right began a process of rethinking to repackage and reinvigorate their racist politics for a post-Holocaust world. And it was the idea of culture that would come to their rescue, becoming a surrogate for race and, in Malik's words, the marrow of the new age. And just as the well-meaning and egalitarian Johann Herder had done so much to legitimate the idea of race, so the well-meaning and egalitarian social anthropologists such as Franz Boas, Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict remapped human differences onto the terrain of culture, and in so doing, Malik tells us, helped construct the bridge over which the ghost of racial thinking was smuggled into the body of cultural pluralism, over which the politics of identity eventually thronged to plant its flag in a new field. And by this route, and under the influence of far-right theorists such as Alain de Benoit, cultural diversity and plurality were reworked into conceptual weapons for a refurbished far right, with culture now a synonym for race, and protection of culture, which is to say white culture, the grounds for a new race-first politics, now marching under the banner of ethno-pluralism and designating globalization, Islam, immigration and assimilation as the enemies of diversity. And this was a new white identity politics carefully calibrated for a new age and especially primed for cyberspace, with new online groups like Generation Identitaire, launched on YouTube in 2012, now pushing an aggressive reactionary identitarianism and a host of far-right conspiracy theories, such as the idea of Eurabia, shorthand for the fantasy plot whereby the EU is working to implement a secret plan to sell Europe to Muslims in exchange for oil, or the Great Replacement theory whereby globalist elites are working to replace the indigenous people of Europe and America with hordes of interchangeable, anonymous and pliable non-Europeans, all of which is part of a reconfigured constellation of hate, with Islam taking the place previously occupied by the Jews, regarded as invaders, imposing their culture and undermining European civilization, not through cosmopolitan power, as had been claimed for the Jews, but through a birth rate primed to replace by force of numbers one culture with another. And if Trump is an American paradigm of this increasingly successful identity politics, then Marie Le Pen and her National Rally Party may be seen as its European exemplar, adeptly wielding culture and diversity as effective instruments of detoxification, skillfully marrying hostility to immigrants with a defence of jobs and opposition to austerity, once left-wing policies but now sacrificed to the imperatives of neoliberalism, and looking to new and youthful membership, all of which coalesced in the second round of the 2024 snap French elections, in which the National Rally won the popular vote, though not, on this occasion, control over the government. This, then, is all part of a larger journey towards identity that has taken hold of politics generally and the politics of race in particular, and which for Malik, whatever its short-term attractions, is, in the long run, a strategic gain for reactionary and racist interests and a strategic loss for anti-racism, which brings us to Section 2, Reclaiming the Universal, and beginning with Part 1, Critiquing Identity Politics. And of course, critiquing identity politics, including black identity politics, is a major theme of this book, and to this end, Malik offers 5 interwoven and mutually reinforcing reasons why, in his view, and understood by the priorities of anti-racism, identity politics is a recipe for failure. And the first is that it's a defeatist politics, which is to say, it's a politics born from defeat and pessimism. As Malik puts it, when the politics of class disintegrated and there was no longer a critique of capitalism, all that was left was the husk of identity, a barren track into which defeated radicalism would now be channeled, not to achieve material change, but into a spiralling cul-de-sac of failure. And pessimism makes for bad theory, bringing us to his second reason, that it's essentialist. And just as there's a myth of race, so there's a myth of a singular race culture, which is what led Julius Leicester, drawing on the philosophy of negritude, to argue that there exists a unique and specifically black culture, which may be witnessed in the way that black people reorder the English language to create new meanings, and through their own language, the language of rhythm. To which Malik responds, in this thinking, Leicester embraces racist tropes about African Americans as non-verbal and possessing a love of rhythm to define them as uniquely black. And it's this idea of being uniquely black, or uniquely any colour, that troubles Malik, that a black skin equates to black thoughts, beliefs, political values, and ways of looking at the world, which is why when Kanye West called Trump my brother and suggested that slavery must have been a choice since it lasted so long, he could not be speaking as a black man. To which Malik cites the philosopher Kwame Appiah in describing this as a case of what he calls life scripts, which work as a kind of unwritten code for the proper way of being black, but which for Malik is no more than an inverted mirror image of the reactionary fantasy of a pure race. And in one of the many twists and turns that he brings to this story of race, Malik draws upon Frantz Fanon, one of the great heroes of identitarian black power, to make his point, who, like that other great hero of black power, Malcolm X, left a complex and contested legacy, including an explicit rejection of identitarian politics, which at that time came in the form of Pan Africanism, which Fanon saw as trapping black people in what he called a fantasy shell of culture and history. And where Pan Africanists celebrated African cultures as authentic, he saw them as mummified, so that rather than supporting living cultures made and remade through struggle, identitarians, he argued, sought out cultures put in capsules and labelled authentic, But he went on to argue there is nothing to warrant the assumption that such a thing as a Negro people exists, and nor do all black people have a single set of experiences. My black skin, he declares, is not the wrapping of specific values. And the essentialism that suggests that it does leads to a third failure, whereby black identity-based social theories are conceptually flawed, with its ideas and arguments weakened by exclusions and rhythm with contradictions, based as they are on the simplistic binary categories of black and white. They leave too much out, particularly class, and are therefore unable to adequately explain a whole range of things, such as police violence. And much more crucially, they obscure the divisions that exist within white and black communities, so vividly illustrated by Kanye West. And these problems and category errors are most exposed in the arguments for white privilege and cultural appropriation. So that if a function of a category is to bring together common experience or qualities, the claim that every white person, from Elon Musk to a cleaner in his factory, carries the same uniform white privilege is easily refuted, as the interests of white factory workers are obviously not the same as those of white bankers. Indeed, amongst the most striking pieces of evidence marshalled by Malik is the fact that in America, someone poor and white is more likely to be killed by the police or imprisoned than wealthy African Americans, leaving Malik to conclude having a white skin does not necessarily provide materially significant privilege, whereas being wealthy may do so, even if you're black. And finally, the whole idea of white privilege Malik sees as a miscategorization in another way, arguing that it's not a privilege to be free from discrimination. And framing it in this way is to create a category not from the existence of something, but from its absence, which is to say, the absence of equal treatment that all of us should enjoy, and which is not properly defined as privilege, but as a universal right. And in a similar way, a close inspection of cultural appropriation reveals similar problems that Malik explores through the controversy surrounding the painting Open Casket by Dana Schultz, depicting the moment, at his mother's insistence, where the swollen and mutilated body of Emmett Till, murdered by white racists in 1955, was at his funeral shown to the world from an open casket and through the photographs of his disfigured body. 60 years later, from those photographs, Schultz painted Open Casket, and in response, British artist Hannah Black organised a petition to have that work destroyed, arguing that Schultz, a white artist, did not have the right to paint this dead black boy. The subject matter, she said, was not hers to decide. And Malik speaks to this through the words of Zadie Smith, when in front of the painting with her children, she pondered whether, as a biracial woman, she was deemed black enough for the subject matter, or whether her children, whose father is white, would also be too white to engage with black suffering. And what of Hannah Black herself, also a biracial woman? Was she black enough to write this letter? All of which prompted Malik to ask, who owns black pain? And what is it for such a thing as pain or music to be owned by a culture? And from all of this flows a fourth reason for failure, where poor theory limits what's possible strategically, arguing that creating racial solidarity is not the same as challenging racism. And because all the energy of black identity politics is channeled into identity, pursuing identity rather than challenging racism becomes its primary purpose. And as the strategic goal changes, so does the tactics, moving from the politics of liberation to the politics of territory, which is to say that black identity politics seeks not to transform society, but to achieve autonomy by controlling its own space, which is why it might be seen as the politics of territory. And for Malik, this is what's at work in the Schultz debate, seeing in Hannah Black's petition an effort to territorialise black pain, demanding that white artists and writers do not engage, to, as the phrase has it, stay in your lane, where the histories and cultures of non-white groups are off limits. And for Malik, this is doubly mistaken. Firstly, because strategically it won't change the material circumstances of black people. As he puts it, stopping the Beatles drawing on the work of blind Willie Johnson does nothing to improve black lives, nor will preventing Dana Schultz from displaying her painting protect the Emmett Tills of today. And secondly, demanding that the painting be destroyed is an explicit rejection for acts of radical sympathy and imaginative identification across racial lines. And all of these failings, the essentialism, poor theory and strategic mistakes, can be seen in the fate and the demise of the Black Power movement, where, as Malik puts it, having discounted the possibilities of working class solidarity, there seemed little left for the Panthers, apart from, on one hand, community action, and on the other, the costume drama of armed surrection. In other words, theirs was a doomed and self-defeating strategy, and in the face of state violence, surveillance and sabotage, it fragmented into faction fighting and finally dismantled itself in the early 1980s. This then was an inward politics of diminishing returns, which leads to Malik's fifth reason for its likely failure, that it is regressive. Regressive by defining potential allies as racial enemies. Regressive because its politics of territory reinforce the power of black elites, who are its gatekeepers, and regressive because it leads to black identitarians to share political ground with racists, both seeing the world in the same hard-shelled binaries of black and white, a positioning which drew the great Pan Africanist leader Marcus Garvey towards the Ku Klux Klan, whom he regarded as better friends of the race than all the other groups of hypocritical whites. And ultimately, what links all the identitarians of left and right is a common hostility to universalism in general and to the Enlightenment in particular, which brings us to part 2, reclaiming the radical Enlightenment. Because for Malik, the uniform rejection of the Enlightenment is in many ways the start point for all this failure, which is not to say that the dominant liberal version of the Enlightenment is not, as mentioned before, saturated with hypocrisy. When J.S. Mill argued that despotism was a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement, he eloquently betrayed the limits of liberal thought. But against this tepid and hypocritical liberal tradition stands another, less known Enlightenment. An Enlightenment of the radical, the poor, the dispossessed and the enslaved, who, in the words of Malik, resisted and condemned racism and colonialism, and who pushed the Enlightenment logic of common humanity to its full and radical conclusion, in the development of its thought, which was decisively shaped by the non-European world, in global struggles and movements made by those denied equality and freedom, and who, in struggling for those ideals, invested them with new and deeper meaning. And all of this was dramatically played out in the Haitian Revolution of 1791, the third great Enlightenment revolution following the American and the French, which began as an insurrection by slaves and ended as a national liberation struggle, after defeating the soldiers from the French monarchy, a Spanish invasion, a British expedition of 60,000 men, and an even larger French force sent by Napoleon, and which along the way reframed the meaning of the rights of man and transfigured the significance of the Enlightenment and what it stood for. And in so doing, the Enlightenment expanded to become an instrument for political consciousness, so that by the end of the 18th century, slave rebellions looked not simply to personal escape, but to the systematic, which is to say political, transformation and the defeat of the entire system, in a self-generating emancipatory logic that made the rights of man, in Malik's view, a tool of liberation more powerful than any sword. Which is why the great abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass, despite dismissing the 4th of July independence celebrations as a sham of hollow mockery, saw the US Constitution as a glorious liberty document and a promise for radical equality, and why even Fanon saw in European thought all the elements of a solution to the great problems of humanity, but which had been squandered by Europe's failure to fulfill the mission its own thought had demanded. And for Malik, this is a failure rooted in the abandonment of class and a class-based perception of the political, which brings us to part 3, restoring class and reviving the political. Because in the age of Trump and Brexit, many liberals have come to despise the working class, and many within the working class feel betrayed and abandoned by liberal elites. And beneath their angry disaffection, there has been, especially in America, a shocking drop in working class longevity and a startling rise in fatalities from suicide, alcohol and drugs. And precisely at the moment when exponential inequality, which is to say class inequality, makes class supremely relevant for both social science and radical politics, the more marginalised the working class has become, the less class has been used as an explanatory tool, erasing it from both academia and politics. And as the politics of race has so vividly illustrated, it has of course been replaced by culture, and it's striking how comprehensive this shift to culture has been. Crime has come to be understood as culture, and working class people have come to see their problems in cultural terms, now channeled through the language of identity and populist politics. Indeed, class itself has been recast as cultural, which is why commentators talk of the white working class, a category that only makes sense in cultural terms. And this conception of politics as culture and one detached from class, Malik sees as an expression of neoliberalism and neoliberal power, describing how, as Britain moved to unregulated capitalism, it became increasingly socially liberal, with a flurry of legislation on race relations, homosexuality and abortion, all matched by a flurry of legislation diminishing the power of trade unions, emphasising political equality while generating ever greater economic inequality and making it easier to persuade working class people that their diminished state was because of minority rights. And what's being lost here isn't just solidarity. It's also the capacity to credibly explain the workings of our social order, replacing the conceptually coherent and powerful category of class, which explains more and explains it more convincingly, with a nebulous and politically expedient category of culture, which explains far less. And Malik illustrates this with a discussion of police violence, citing numerous forms of evidence to claim that while racism is involved in the disproportionate numbers of black people killed by the police, that disproportion cannot be explained solely as the product of racism. Black people, he argues, have suffered grievously and disproportionately from police violence, but paradoxically not simply because of racism, nor is it just African Americans who have suffered grievously and disproportionately. Working class people, black, white, Hispanic, Native American, have too. And there is strong evidence to correlate police violence with poverty. Simply put, the poorer the neighbourhood, the greater the risk of being killed by the police. And African Americans are disproportionately poor and working class. And all of this is lost as explanations of crime abandon class for culture, and so also is the possibility for a changed-based solution to that crime, as social issues become reframed as matters of law and order, and problems are no longer to be solved but to be policed, and where law enforcement has also been refashioned as the application of force to keep the lower classes in their place. This is important, Malik tells us, because it allows us to see contemporary police violence in a different context, not just as the product of racism, but also as a consequence of a long campaign to contain the lower class and of the shift to policing rather than assuaging poverty. Equally, it is class, not culture, that best explains numerous forms of social conflict between such things as the overwhelmingly black sanitation workers of New Orleans and the black-owned sanitation company who employed them, when in 2020 these workers went on strike over COVID, poverty wages and the lack of safety equipment. And for Malik, the story of this strike is one little vignette which speaks volumes about the state of black politics. As he puts it, the New Orleans sanitation workers came out on strike 3 weeks before George Floyd was murdered, and they remained on strike throughout the protests that swept the nation and brought racism and black lives to global consciousness. Yet, by September, they had been forced back to work, having won few of their demands. Black bosses are little different from white bosses, and it does not matter to them if they and their black workers are supposed to be part of the same global family. The lesson is that challenging racism and defending the rights of black workers requires solidarity beyond that rooted in racial identity. Which brings us to the second of the two traditions of anti-racism that I mentioned at the beginning of this film and that can be traced throughout American history. A tradition whose solidarity, universalism and internationalism is rooted in the radical enlightenment. A tradition of W.E.B. Du Bois and civil rights unionism, where blackness was a political rather than a racial category, where, in the words of Du Bois, the black man is a person who must ride Jim Crow in Georgia, and the kinship of black people is found in the badge of slavery, discrimination and insult, which binds together not just black people, but the oppressed and the working classes everywhere. And in the many vignettes through which Malik tells the story of this tradition, we hear how Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, the firebrand radical and the liberal champion of the American dream, both reworked their visions and reinvented themselves in a political journey that took them closer to each other and closer to class. But of all the many surprises in this story, it's the role of the Communist Party in the early 20th century that stands out as the exemplar of how this tradition might speak to today's anti-racism. And whilst communist policies then were opportunist, sectarian and designed to further the interests of Moscow, paradoxically and for a short period of time, the American Communist Party fearlessly challenged racial terror and embraced black members in an unprecedented way, offering them a new kind of political self-activity where they could analyse, discuss and criticise the society in which they lived, and giving them a framework to understand the roots of poverty and racism, and which linked their struggle for liberation to the liberation and working class struggles across the world. Indeed, it's because of the Communist Party that the Scottsboro Boys, framed for rape in 1931, were not executed, while the Central Park Five, also framed for rape in 1989, but without the global publicity, mass protests and legal support of the left, why they languished in jail until 2002, when the real rapist confessed. And for Malik, it's the turn to identity and the demand to stay in your lane that has changed the political landscape from the solidarity of 1931 to the indifference of 1989, because the demand to stay in your lane is in many ways the antithesis of politics, which is to say it's the antithesis of socially transformative political engagement. And it's to the radical universalist tradition that we must look to reclaim it as the most cogent, deep-seated, far-reaching challenge to racism and the concept of race, And it was the erosion of that tradition and the diminished sense of the political that came with it that has reinvigorated the idea of race. And to transcend it requires that once again we resurrect radical universalism. This then concludes Kenan Malik's Not So Black and White, a provocative, stimulating, comprehensive and brave intervention retelling the story of race and how we might better transcend it.